At 14:17 local time, the carrier's surface search radar picked up the first unusual sign. 3 contacts appeared almost at once. They were small, faint, and moving in a loose formation. At first, they seemed like ordinary traffic on the water until their speed changed. Within 2 minutes, all 3 contacts accelerated. The operations center did not react with panic. It never does. The tracks were marked, timed, and classified. Course, speed, bearing, distance, every detail was logged. The watch team had seen similar patterns before, and at sea, patterns often matter more than stated intentions. The contacts were Venezuelan naval vessels operating outside territorial waters, well within international sea lanes. That alone was not unusual. What mattered was their heading. All 3 vessels were moving on converging courses, angled not to pass by, but to close in. The closest point of approach was calculated, then calculated again. Each time, the numbers grew smaller. On the bridge, nothing visibly changed. No sudden turns, no dramatic reaction. The aircraft carrier stayed on course while her escorts held formation. At sea, the first rule is simple. Do not show uncertainty. Every movement sends a message, whether intended or not. At 14:23, the officer of the deck approved the first radio call. The message was calm, clear, and professional, sent over an open maritime channel. Identification was requested. Intentions were asked for. The call was repeated according to protocol, first in English, then in Spanish. There was no answer. In naval encounters, silence is never just silence. By then, the Venezuelan vessels were no longer simply passing through. Their speed had settled at a level that did not match routine patrol movement. Their spacing became tighter. One vessel shifted 5 degrees to port. Another matched the movement to starboard. It was subtle, but it was not random. Inside the operations center, analysts began assembling the full picture. Past encounters were reviewed. Known capabilities were checked. Command patterns were compared. Nothing pointed to an immediate clash, but the situation was clearly a test. And tests at sea are evaluated carefully, not guessed at. At 14:28, the carrier group moved into a higher state of awareness. No sirens sounded, no loud announcements echoed through the passageways. The shift was quiet, disciplined, and procedural, almost invisible to anyone not trained to notice it. Sensor coverage expanded. Electronic surveillance systems began passive recording. Nothing unnecessary was transmitted. One of the biggest myths about aircraft carriers is that they are slow giants, able to rely only on size and power. The truth is more complex. A carrier controls the sea not through speed or aggression, but through information, layers of protection, and time. And now time mattered more than anything. At 14:31, an escort destroyer established visual contact through its optical systems. 3 gray hulls, naval flags visible, crew members on deck, no visible signs of immediate preparation. But at sea, posture can matter more than appearance. The Venezuelan vessels were still closing. No one on the American side raised their voice. No orders were rushed. Every step followed procedures shaped by decades of maritime encounters. Those procedures are built around one principle: control the situation before it controls you. The goal was not to create a dramatic standoff. The goal was to keep one from becoming necessary. As the range continued to shrink, the carrier's captain reviewed the information in silence. Distance, relative motion, communications, and timing. Everything pointed to a calculated move. Pressure without direct provocation. Proximity without open escalation. A test. The Venezuelan commanders likely understood that an aircraft carrier represents power. What they may not have fully considered is what else it represents: restraint, backed by enormous capability. At 14:34, the next phase was authorized. Not threats, not aggressive moves. Presence. Because at sea, the moment before escalation is often the most important moment of all. Escalation on the water rarely begins with a single dramatic action. More often, it begins with distance. By 14:36 local time, the 3 Venezuelan vessels had closed to a range that could no longer be treated as accidental. Their formation tightened again. Each ship kept disciplined spacing, moving like one coordinated element rather than separate patrol units. This was no longer coincidence. It was intent expressed through movement. Inside the operations center, the display was clean and unmistakable. 3 surface tracks, parallel vectors, and gradual speed changes designed to reduce distance without crossing the line into an immediate response. It was the kind of maneuver used to apply pressure, just enough to be noticed, not enough to openly justify the next step. The carrier group did not change course. That choice was deliberate. In naval doctrine, holding course under pressure sends a clear message: confidence. Turning too early can be misread. It can suggest uncertainty or worse, concession. So the carrier remained steady, and her escorts did the same, forming a moving perimeter that required no explanation. At 14:39, a second round of radio calls was sent. Again, the tone was professional. Again, the wording stayed neutral. Identification was requested. A safety advisory was included. International navigation standards were referenced. The message went out twice, once in English and once in Spanish. Every transmission was logged. Every second was recorded. Still, there was no response. Repeated silence becomes information. Electronic surveillance teams began passive collection in full. No interference. No unnecessary signals. Just listening, recording, and building the clearest possible picture of what was happening across the water. No active radar illumination, only listening. Every radar sweep, every navigation signal from the Venezuelan ships was captured, analyzed, and stored. In modern naval encounters, information collected in a matter of minutes can influence planning for years. On the flight deck, everything still looked routine. Aircraft remained parked. Crews moved with calm precision. To anyone watching from a distance, there was no obvious sign of tension. That calm was intentional. Visible stability lowers the chance of misunderstanding. It gives the other side fewer signals to misread, fewer reasons to assume panic or confusion. But below deck, the posture had already changed. Aviation teams were placed on standby, not to launch immediately, but to be ready. Helicopter crews reviewed their tasking profiles. Surveillance systems were prepared. Cameras were checked. Sensors were aligned. Every step was completed quietly, without drama. This was not about intimidation. It was about having options. At 14:42, one Venezuelan warship adjusted course slightly, angling closer toward the outer screen of the strike group. The movement was small, less than 10 degrees, but the effect was immediate. The closest point of approach dropped again. The time remaining before that point was now measured in minutes. The bridge crew showed no outward reaction. The log did. Every movement was recorded with exact detail. Speed changes, course shifts, relative bearing, and timing. This record was not only operational, it also mattered legally. In maritime confrontations, documentation can be just as important as control. At this stage, the encounter remained limited. No visible systems were directed, no launch covers opened, no dramatic gestures were made. But the absence of obvious escalation did not mean the absence of pressure. Pressure was being applied through distance, persistence, and the refusal to disengage. And pressure works in both directions. The carrier strike group's layered defenses were now fully alert, even if they remained quiet. Surface, air, and electronic domains were synchronized. The carrier itself stayed at the calm center of the formation, projecting stability rather than threat. That stability carried weight. Aircraft carriers are built not only to respond to conflict, but also to keep conflict from becoming necessary. Their presence changes the calculations of anyone who challenges them. Every approach forces decisions, and every decision carries consequences far beyond the visible horizon. At 14:45, the decision was made to expand the response, not by increasing tension, but by widening awareness. Authorization was granted for aerial presence. A helicopter launch does not automatically signal aggression. It signals that the situation is being watched closely. Eyes in the air, sensors extended, evidence collected. It is a controlled, non-lethal step meant to clarify intent without forcing a confrontation. The order was passed quietly. Flight deck crews moved with practiced efficiency. No rush, no raised voices. The aircraft was prepared for observation, not intimidation. Cameras, infrared sensors, and communication systems were the main tools now. As the helicopter prepared to lift, the Venezuelan warships continued their approach. Same speed, same formation. They had not crossed a hard line yet, but they were moving directly toward one. And now they were about to be seen far more clearly than before. Because at sea, the moment pressure becomes visible is often the moment it begins to lose strength. What came next was not about force. It was about presence, proof, and patience. And that combination has ended more standoffs than hard power ever has. At 14:48 local time, the helicopter lifted from the deck. There was no announcement, no visible urgency. Just the controlled rise of rotor blades above the carrier strike group. To an outside observer, it may have looked routine, but to everyone tracking the encounter, it marked a clear shift. The situation had moved from surface movement to layered control. The aircraft climbed to a modest altitude, turned outward, and accelerated toward the 3 Venezuelan warships. Its mission was not to threaten, it was to observe, identify, and record. In modern naval operations, cameras and sensors can carry more influence than visible force. From the moment the helicopter cleared the deck, its sensor suite went active. Electro-optical cameras focused on the nearest vessel. Infrared systems mapped engine heat and exhaust signatures. Every frame was time-stamped. Every bearing was logged. Nothing was left to guesswork. Below, the carrier and her escorts held formation. They did not move closer. They did not pull back. They simply remained steady, letting the aircraft extend their awareness while the entire encounter continued to unfold under careful observation. They waited. As the helicopter crossed the midpoint between the two forces, the Venezuelan ships came into clear view. Hull numbers could be read, flags could be identified, deck crews were visible, some stopping briefly to look up as the aircraft approached. No systems were actively manned, no aggressive gestures were made. But at sea, posture is not defined by visible equipment alone. The helicopter slowed and entered a lateral orbit, staying well outside unsafe range. This was not a flyover. It was a controlled, measured presence, close enough to be clearly understood, far enough to avoid unnecessary provocation. A standard advisory was transmitted in a calm, professional tone. The message stated position, intent, and safety expectations. Then it was repeated in Spanish. The tone never changed. At sea, how something is said can matter just as much as the words themselves. This time, there was a response. It was brief and vague, an acknowledgement without a clear commitment. The Venezuelan ships did not change course immediately, but the silence had been broken. That alone changed the atmosphere. Inside the operations center, analysts watched closely. Communication patterns were logged, sig strength was measured. Even a short reply can reveal important details: crew readiness, command discipline, and how quickly decisions move through the chain. The helicopter continued its orbit. From above, the situation looked different. The angles that had seemed deliberate from the surface now appeared more restricted. The Venezuelan ships had less room to maneuver without crossing clear safety margins. An aircraft overhead can narrow options in ways surface vessels cannot. At 1454, the first visible shift appeared. One Venezuelan warship reduced speed by a small but measurable amount. Another adjusted slightly outward, increasing separation by a fraction of a mile. These were not retreats, they were recalculations. The helicopter did not react. It held altitude, it held distance, it kept observing. On the carrier, flight operations remained calm. No additional aircraft were launched, none were needed. The objective was not to overwhelm. The objective was to make the situation clear, and clarity was beginning to emerge. The Venezuelan formation no longer held perfect alignment. Spacing increased, headings began to diverge in subtle ways. These were signs of reassessment, not defeat. But reassessment is often the first step away from escalation. At 1457, a second advisory was transmitted. This one was shorter. It repeated the importance of navigational safety and confirmed that all movements were being observed and recorded. No threats, no ultimatums. The response came faster this time. It was more formal, still cautious, still restrained, but no longer unclear. The helicopter's cameras captured every detail. Deck crew movements slowed. Officers returned to enclosed positions. The visual language was unmistakable. The approach was being reconsidered. Below, the carrier strike group remained unchanged. That consistency was the message. In maritime confrontations, the side that waits longest often holds the stronger position. By refusing to react too early, the strike group pushed the pressure back toward the side that had created it. At 1502, the shift became undeniable. The lead Venezuelan warship adjusted course away from the carrier's projected track. The turn was gradual, almost casual, as if designed to avoid the appearance of backing down. But the data told the real story. Closest point of approach increased. Time to that point stretched out. The helicopter adjusted its orbit to maintain visual coverage, but it did not follow aggressively. Presence, not pursuit. Within minutes, the tension that had shaped the encounter began to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. No direct engagement had occurred. No warnings had been pushed further. Yet the outcome was already taking form. The helicopter remained overhead, a quiet witness to the resolution of a challenge built on proximity rather than open confrontation. And as the distance widened, one fact became clear to everyone involved. The moment of pressure had passed. What remained was the record, the restraint, and the quiet understanding that at sea, the most decisive actions are often the ones almost no one sees. By 1506 local time, the geometry of the encounter had changed. Not sharply, not suddenly, but enough to matter. The three Venezuelan warships were no longer closing. Their formation had loosened, and the distance between them had widened in careful increments. The movement suggested coordination, not confusion. Speed reductions were modest, almost impossible to notice with the naked eye, but unmistakable on radar. The numbers told the story before anyone said it aloud. The closest point of approach was now increasing. Inside the operations center, no one treated it like a celebration. This was not a win in the dramatic sense. It was a transition. Encounters at sea rarely end with announcements. They end through choices, often quiet ones, made when the risk no longer matches the reward. The helicopter stayed on station, holding its steady orbit. It did not move closer. It did not pull farther away. Its message was simple. You were observed before, and you are still being observed now. On the Venezuelan ships, movement began to slow. Deck activity became less focused. Personnel moved away from exposed areas. Hatches were secured. The outward display of pressure was giving way to internal reassessment. That mattered. Naval challenges are rarely about raw capability alone. They are about control of the story, about testing boundaries without clearly crossing them. The Venezuelan commanders had made their approach. They had closed distance. They had ignored the first calls. And now, facing layered awareness instead of an emotional response, they were reconsidering their next move. At 15:09, the lead Venezuelan vessel transmitted again. This time, the message was formal and diplomatic in tone. It referred to sovereign patrol activity near national waters. It requested awareness of proximity and safe navigation. The wording was carefully chosen, firm without becoming openly confrontational. The response from the U.S. side came immediately. Calm, precise, measured. International waters were confirmed. Lawful transit was stated. Unsafe maneuvering was documented. The tone did not rise, and it did not soften. It simply laid out the facts. And at sea, facts carry weight. From that point forward, the dynamic changed completely. The Venezuelan ships continued adjusting course. Each individual change was small enough to preserve appearances, but together they changed the outcome. Separation increased, relative bearing stabilized. The pressure that had shaped the encounter began dissolving into distance. The helicopter completed another orbit, then widened its pattern slightly. It was not a retreat. It was a signal that the immediate phase was nearing its end. Sensors remained active. Recording continued. Nothing was considered finished until the situation was fully clear. On the carrier, nothing changed. The strike group maintained speed, heading, and formation. That consistency was not accidental. It was doctrine. By staying unchanged throughout the encounter, the carrier sent one clear message. The challenge had not affected the mission. That kind of clarity is difficult to counter. By 1514, the Venezuelan warships were no longer on intercept courses. Their headings continued to separate. One vessel turned outward, increasing lateral distance. Another reduced speed to a level more consistent with routine patrol than deliberate approach. There was no announcement marking the end of the standoff. There almost never is. Instead, the encounter faded the way most maritime confrontations do, through distance, documentation, and disciplined restraint. No ship had to publicly back down. No side had to be openly embarrassed. But the balance had shifted. The helicopter was instructed to return. As it turned back toward the carrier, its sensors captured the final frames of the Venezuelan formation, moving away into open water. Those images would later be archived, reviewed, and filed alongside many others from similar encounters around the world. Each one a data point, each one a lesson. On deck, the aircraft landed smoothly. The rotors slowed. Crews moved in with practiced efficiency. To an outside observer, it may have looked like the end of an ordinary flight. In reality, it marked the close of a calculated test. The Venezuelan ships continued on their adjusted courses, keeping distance and no longer pressing the situation. The carrier strike group continued on its original track, unaffected, uninterrupted, and unchanged. No direct engagement had taken place, no warnings had been pushed further, yet the result was clear. At sea, power is not shown only through force. It is shown through the ability to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively, to project presence without provocation, and to let time work in your favor. This encounter followed that pattern exactly. It ended not with noise, not with spectacle, but with distance quietly restored and boundaries unmistakably understood. By 1518 local time, the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan warships were no longer moving as one coordinated element. Their courses had separated into what looked like routine patrol movement. Speed steadied. Distance increased with every minute. On radar, the picture slowly returned to something that resembled normal traffic at sea. But what had just happened was not routine. From the outside, there was no dramatic scene, no sudden escalation, no visible confrontation across the decks. To someone watching without context, it may have looked simple. 3 vessels approached, held their line for a time, then quietly moved away. That reading would miss the entire point. What unfolded was a controlled test of boundaries, and a clear example of how modern naval power can be used without a single dramatic move. The Venezuelan commanders had applied pressure through proximity. They closed distance deliberately, ignored the first radio calls, and shaped their movements to challenge presence without crossing into open confrontation. It was a familiar gray zone method designed to test reactions, collect responses, and send a political signal while staying below the threshold of a larger incident. What they met was not overreaction. They met discipline. From the first radar contact to the final course adjustment, the carrier strike group followed a doctrine built around one idea. Control escalation before escalation controls the situation. Every action was measured. Every decision was recorded. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was improvised. The aircraft carrier did not turn away. It did not speed up. It did not issue dramatic gestures. It simply remained what it was, the stable center of the formation, the point around which every other decision had to be calculated. That stability matters. Aircraft carriers are often described through numbers, aircraft, escorts, systems, range, and reach. But in moments like this, their greatest value is not found in statistics alone. It is found in the way they compress time and space for anyone challenging them. They force the other side to think beyond the next move. Every mile closed was a mile documented. Every unanswered call was recorded. Every signal was captured. By choosing proximity, the Venezuelan ships also chose visibility. Their movements, communications, and electronic patterns were collected without interference and without the need for direct confrontation. Information moved in one direction. That imbalance can be decisive. When the helicopter lifted off, the entire dynamic changed. Airborne sensors turned uncertainty into clarity. Intent became easier to read. Maneuvering space became tighter. Options became more limited. The pressure that had been pushed outward began to turn back inward. And when reassessment began, it appeared in small details: reduced speed, subtle course changes, and the return of radio communication. None of those actions alone meant the challenge was over. Together, they told the full story. The Carrier Strike Group did not chase. It did not press for a public concession. It did not try to turn the moment into a spectacle. Because at sea, visible concessions are rarely the real objective. The objective is precedent. It is memory. It is the quiet understanding on both sides of how far pressure can be applied before it begins working against the side applying it. That understanding was reinforced that afternoon. The Venezuelan ships left the encounter having made their political signal. The United States left having changed nothing operationally. The carrier continued its transit. The strike group remained intact. The mission carried on without interruption. That outcome favors the side that does not need to adjust. Later, analysts would review the encounter in detail. Timelines would be rebuilt, distances would be plotted, communications would be examined, not simply to assign responsibility, but to improve future responses. Every encounter like this becomes part of a larger record. Each one helps shape the decisions that follow. Because this was not an isolated moment. Similar encounters are happening across the world's oceans with increasing frequency. They belong to an environment where competition often replaces open conflict, and where presence can carry more meaning than provocation. In that environment, restraint is not weakness, it is leverage. The real turning point was not the moment the ships changed course. It was the fact that nothing further happened. No miscalculation, no irreversible step, no sudden move taken under the pressure of close distance. That is the outcome modern navies train to achieve. And long after the radar screens cleared and the helicopter was secured, the most important result remained simple and unchanged. The carrier stayed on course. The mission stayed intact. And the balance at sea stayed exactly where it had been. This will not be the last encounter of its kind. As competition across the world's oceans grows, these quiet, measured, deliberate moments will play an increasingly important role in shaping global maritime balance. And when they do, the real story will rarely be about what was used. It will be about what was avoided. For more real-world naval encounters, strategic breakdowns, and professional military analysis, subscribe to Navy Clash. Stay informed, stay ahead, and don't miss the next moment when history shifts, not through spectacle, but through decisions. We'll see you in the next one.